Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. One way of achieving that mission is listening to experts discuss pressing local, national, and international issues. Before COVID struck, concerned citizens met regularly to hear these experts. After COVID arrived, concerned citizens turned to Zoom, video recording talks, panels, and debates for later broadcast on this channel. Now that COVID is in remission, our main menu is again in-person meetings. But for those of you unable to join us, Village TV is video recording our in-person speakers for later broadcast on this program. In addition, when the right opportunity comes along, Concerned Citizens Presents will continue to offer the occasional remote speaker. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I am a member of the committee responsible for these broadcasts. Today's program is being recorded on Zoom in May 2022. It features a guest speaker, a few inquisitive concerned citizens, and myself. The program is devoted to cannabis, its role in the war on drugs, its changing legal status, its contributions to the well-being of Americans, especially elderly Americans, and its potential to further enhance human well-being in the future. Now, you might be wondering why Concerned Citizens, an organization committed to social justice, is offering a program on cannabis. So before introducing our guest speaker, I have asked Jonathan Adler, a longtime member of Concerned Citizens, to give us a little background on the role that Concerned Citizens has played in educating residents of Laguna Woods about cannabis. Jonathan.
Thank you, Sue. If you go back to the first years of the 2000s, remember that our situation nationally and locally, there was a lot of ferment about the possible value of medical cannabis and discussion about legalization and the war on drugs. California had passed Prop 215, the Compassionate Use Act, in 1996. And locally, we had a lot of our village, our community of seniors with medical conditions that very possibly could benefit from use of medical cannabis. So Concerned Citizens sponsored a forum with some very, very, very prominent panelists and questioners. And we were co-sponsored with some leading organizations, local chapters of the organizations such as the League of Women Voters, the American Association of University Professors, National Council of Jewish Women, and the Democratic Club. And jointly, we put on a program, a forum, which drew a very large audience. And we looked at issues ranging from the political at the federal, state, local, and community level to the very pragmatic issues of what conditions has medical cannabis been shown to help with, and the practicalities of how people could take advantage of those opportunities. That was frankly, a fairly historic event, at least for this community, and it gave birth to Laguna Woods Medical Cannabis Club and the cultivation of cannabis in our community gardens, and the city then authorizing a dispensary. And those issues persist to this day with cities having zoning control over dispensaries. So with that background, Concerned Citizens has been involved in this issue really since, for the last 13 years, shall we say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's very interesting. Not all of us have been members quite that long, although some, of course, have been for longer because we are a 40-year-old organization. Now for today's guest speaker. Rabbi James Kahn is executive director at Holistic Industries, a company that distributes cannabis products and educates people about how best to use those products. An ordained rabbi, James Kahn began working in the cannabis field in 2011 when he joined other members of his family in founding the Tacoma Cannabis Dispensary in Washington, D.C. The motivation for opening the dispensary was to assist patients suffering from ailments that respond to cannabis, a motivation he retains today. Rabbi Kahn holds a BA from the University of Florida and studied for the rabbinate at Hebrew College in Newton, Mass. He lives and works in Silver Spring, Maryland, but travels extensively, educating Americans about the benefits of cannabis. Welcome, Rabbi James.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It is an honor to be here and speaking to the concerned citizens of Laguna Woods. It really is. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So you did a great job giving a little bit of background, and I'll fill in a little bit more of the picture, because for any of the listeners out there who are wondering, is it typical for a rabbi to be working in the cannabis industry? The answer is no. It's not typical. It was not my plan when I entered the rabbinate. But I am following in my father's footsteps. And so I'm not the only rabbi involved in cannabis. In fact, my entire life with cannabis really started with my family. My grandfather, at the age of 40, was diagnosed with MS, and within 5 years was completely bedbound. So I grew up with a grandfather who was really paralyzed from the neck down and suffered incredibly because of MS. And he was the first person, actually, when I was 14 years old, he asked me to get him some cannabis. And I almost fell over. And it took me a few years to make peace with that idea, but I actually ended up getting him cannabis. And I got to see firsthand the impact that it had on him, on his neuropathy, which is that kind of the pins and needles sensation you can get in your fingers. But folks with MS can really have that extreme pain from that, or different spasticity issues, shakiness, that really was only helped by cannabis. So my family eventually came around to the idea that this product was helping our loved one. And we became passionate about ensuring he had access to cannabis. And so that's kind of the impetus for my family's involvement in cannabis. And we really became, it really became an issue of social justice for us. And it's one of the things that I'm kind of most passionate about regarding cannabis, is ensuring that access to cannabis is viewed as an issue of justice, especially in religious communities, my own in particular, which has a strong emphasis on what we call tikkun olam, the concept of repairing the world, of recognizing humanity's place in this world as we're here to complete the task of making the world what it can be. And so to see cannabis, being spoken about in synagogues and mosques and churches, that's really something that I am passionate about. And given the fact that, I think just this week, we saw incredible news from the CDC, something like 110,000 Americans overdosed on opiates in last year. Up from 70,000 the year before, both records, astonishing records. Knowing that so many people use cannabis to either get off of opioids or potentially to avoid them in the first place, to me makes cannabis, it's an issue of life and death for some folks. And for me, that again makes this an issue of utmost importance for me and for the communities that I belong to. So I'm going to jump into a presentation that I put together for us, just to kind of give some visuals and to introduce you a little bit more to this world of cannabis and my background in it, and we're going to try to debunk a few fictions, a few myths around cannabis, and try to broaden our perspective. And I'm happy to have some representatives from the concerned citizens of Laguna Woods, and please interrupt me. You're representing the listeners today, and so if you have questions, I'm sure those folks have questions too. So I do not stand on ceremony here. You're welcome to interrupt. All right. So I work, as you said, with Holistic Industries. Actually, it's one of the largest privately held cannabis companies in the country. We're in 9 different states and the District of Columbia. We are a vertically integrated company, which means we both grow the cannabis, we process the cannabis in our labs into different products, and transport it to retail stores, our own retail stores and other retail stores so that we sell wholesale to. And so we really represent from seed to sale, or from farm to table. That's what Holistic Industries is. And so I work for the social impact, the corporate social responsibility team there. I lead that team, and I have the mission of making cannabis a force for good, and to really ensure that the resources generated from the legal sale of cannabis helps address some of the harms caused by cannabis prohibition. We'll talk about those a little later. But many folks are aware of actually an amazing statistic I just heard was that even still today in 2022, every 90 seconds, somebody is arrested for cannabis in this country. Every 90 seconds. And more often than not, at a rate that far exceeds their representation within the population. Those folks are people of color. 3.6 people of color are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis than white folks, despite equal use patterns. So this is an issue of life and death. This is an issue of justice, and it's one I'm clearly passionate about. All right, cannabis for seniors. So as I said, this is a family affair. This is actually my family's dispensary. Not only do I work for a large cannabis company with roots all over the country, but my family owns an independent mom and pop store in DC, the very first store in DC, the first dispensary opened nearly 10 years ago. And that's a whole story unto itself, but really opened again in inspiration, really inspired by my grandparents. And there's a picture of my grandfather at my bar mitzvah. And my grandmother behind him, who sadly passed away from lung cancer. She was a lifelong smoker, but also really benefited from cannabis. She unfortunately was living in New Jersey at the time, and there was no legal cannabis option for her. So she was lucky enough to get access to cannabis via a couple of her aides. But by and large didn't have cannabis. And what killed her really more than the cancer was wasting away from having no appetite. We don't often think of the munchies as life-saving, but they can be. And cannabis's ability to stimulate appetite can make all the difference in someone who's struggling and endure chemotherapy. So there's my grandfather and grandmother. As I said, I'm a rabbi. For me, this starts in the very beginning, in the book of Genesis, when God said, "Behold, I've given you every herb-yielding seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed to you, it shall be for consumption, for food." For those listeners who are interested and wondering, is cannabis kosher? It is actually kosher. Interestingly enough, cannabis as a plant doesn't actually need a rabbi to supervise it. Plants are kosher. However, often plants are still carefully inspected to make sure there's no bugs in them. It's one of the benefits of shopping in a regulated cannabis store is that it's highly regulated, and all the product is inspected by a lab and tested, so there are no bugs in legal regulated cannabis. But if you're buying cannabis on the black market, that would be a reason to check if you wanted to keep your cannabis kosher. But actually, even the Orthodox Union has issued a kosher certification for an edible, cannabis edible. It's really this idea that cannabis actually can be a mitzvah. And this is put forth by Rabbi Menachem Genak, the CEO of the Orthodox Union. And if you look at a lot of your kosher food, there'll be a stamp that says OU, and that is their stamp. And Rabbi Menachem Genek says, using medical cannabis products recommended by a physician should not be regarded as a chet, which is a sinful act, but rather as a mitzvah, an imperative, a commandment. The idea here is that there's no mitzvah, there's no commandment to suffer. God does not rejoice in suffering. And so if we are able to do something that improves our quality of life, then we are actually commanded to do that, because we're here to live this life. This is a gift, and we are here to enjoy it and to get the most out of it. And anyone who has dealt with chronic pain knows that that is a detriment to enjoying life. Acute pain is one thing. We can get through, we can tough out a lot, but those who wake up every morning to chronic pain, who endure pain day in and day out, it is wearing. It can really wear people down, and it's not a life that I wish for anybody. So if cannabis can help, according to Rabbi Menachem, go for it. Also, some of you may know that Israel has become a hub of medical cannabis research. The father of the medical cannabis movement, Professor Raphael Meshulam, came out of Hebrew University. He's the guy who actually discovered THC, the psychoactive chemical in cannabis. This is a great moment, at least for me, watching two rabbis bless the leaves of cannabis. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this. I show you this stuff because I'm really trying to change people's perspective around cannabis. The war on drugs has been incredibly effective at impacting the way we view cannabis. I even find myself, after 10 years in the industry, feeling like every time I tell someone that I use cannabis, it's almost like it's like an admission instead of a conversation. Like I'm being grilled, that I feel guilty about. So I'm constantly pushing myself to talk about cannabis, to share my experiences with cannabis as a way, and to elevate, show rabbis blessing cannabis as a way of challenging the stigma and shame that keeps so many people from even considering this plant that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. In fact, medical cannabis has been used by humans for nearly 12,000 years. We have everywhere humans went, they have planted cannabis. We're even finding most recently cannabis at the, this would not be your local dispensary. We're even finding cannabis these days. Here, I'll pause this for one moment. We're even finding cannabis at the heart of ancient Jewish life. There's a archaeological dig in Israel called Tel Arad. It's about 30 miles south of Jerusalem. And there is a temple that mirrors the great temple in Jerusalem, dating back before the Common Era. I think it was 800 BCE. They recently were excavating and were able to use modern technology to analyze a resin that they found on top of an altar outside the holiest space in this temple. And what did they find that this resin contained? It contained THC, which is that psychoactive ingredient in cannabis. So outside this holy of holies at the great temple in Israel, a space where in the ancient Jewish mind, this was the place where God and man met, the holiest place on earth. It was basically humanity's attempt to create a space on earth that God could inhabit. And so what in that holy of holies, what made up that space? Well, it was a series of concentric rooms where each room was understood to be a holier spot. And at the very center was this Holy of Holies, and outside the door of the Holy of Holies, which was only entered into once a year. And it was such a scary experience. They would even tie a rope around the priest. They would tie a rope just in case he got so overwhelmed with rapture that they would have to pull him out of the Holy of Holies. So they would tie a rope around him. And outside this Holy of Holies were these altars burning cannabis leaves, mixed with cow dung to make sure that it burned slow and low temperature, which would have been enough to release the psychoactive properties of cannabis. So it was really amazing to see cannabis at the heart of Western civilization. I mean, the oldest archaeological finding that relates to smokable cannabis dates back 2,500 years to what's now considered Western China. There in a burial tomb, archaeologists uncovered ancient clay pots that had been filled with cannabis leaves, along with hot stones. And mourners would carry them around during mourning, their funeral procession, and again inhale the smoke as part of their mourning rituals. So cannabis has been with humans for a long time, and it was actually part of the U.S. pharmacopoeia up until the early 20th century. It's really a modern reality. The last 100 years, the last 50 years, that cannabis has been vilified, and really, right now, still the federal government treats cannabis, categorizes cannabis as a Schedule I drug. But cannabis is understood to be a Schedule I drug, which has no medicinal value. That incongruency is really a modern one, and really a development that has its roots in racism. It's one of the reasons that cannabis, which is a scientific name of the plant Cannabis sativa, it was called marijuana, which has really racist roots. It was connecting it to its Spanish, its Mexican, the Mexican word for cannabis, which at the time, there was a lot of racism towards Mexicans, and it was a way of kind of vilifying cannabis and making people scared of it. So we use the word cannabis, we're reclaiming that, but really cannabis has been with us for a long time. So I'm trying to share that.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt? Could you explain? I think not all our viewers got that completely. Okay. So this connection between marijuana and the Mexicans, could you just detail that a little bit more, please? Okay.
So the scientific name of cannabis sativa, the actual name of the plant, that is what we like to use, because it wasn't that the cannabis has always been called marijuana. That was really a reality of the 20th century, when politicians, the FBI, Nixon, in creating the war on drugs, they wanted to vilify a plant. So how do you vilify a plant? Well, you connect it to other marginalized members of society who are already vilified. People were already scared of brown people at that time. They were different. So if we made cannabis something that Black folks did, that jazz musicians did, then there was this fear, the same fear that perhaps an ignorant white American might have about their daughter dating and it being an interracial relationship, that fear was then attached to cannabis, and using cannabis could also make somebody enter that marginalized world of which white folks wanted to stay separate from, or at least the ignorant white folks did. So cannabis was called marijuana. It really was a PR scheme, a propaganda tool. So that's why you'll hear a lot of folks try to reclaim this word cannabis and stay away from that term marijuana. Does that make a little bit more sense?
That's great. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And please continue to interrupt me if there's something more there. But great. So I'm going to jump back into my presentation here, see if I can. Boom. All right. So the reason I'm showing you this picture is just to give you a sense of what, if you've never been to a cannabis dispensary, forget the address there because I happen to live in the Maryland area, but that's what a dispensary can look like. This is not a place that you should feel uncomfortable going to, at least, not the license regulated ones. And we put a lot of money and resources towards really elevating the cannabis experience, what we call liberating cannabis. It's why our stores are actually called Liberty. Because we are trying to liberate cannabis, liberate it from a mindset that really came out of the unregulated black market where cannabis was criminalized and where cannabis users were criminals. Oops. Okay, a few facts and fictions and facts about cannabis. Cannabis is a crime. Well, cannabis is a crime federally, but not in California and not in my state of Maryland. In fact, at this point in history, in US history, 48 states, cannabis, there are some type of cannabis laws that allow consumption of cannabis. It's the vast majority of us live in states that allow medical cannabis, and half the country lives in states that allow adult use cannabis, recreational cannabis. I like to reference Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who often referred to as America's doctor. We used to see him on CNN a lot. He did a wonderful documentary called Weed. I think there's 3 parts to it now. Anyone who wants to learn more about the history of cannabis in this country should look it up. It's online. But Sanjay Gupta, who played a role in kind of vilifying cannabis and parroting what he had heard up until that point about cannabis, did his own research and came out and said that we have been terribly and systemically misled for nearly 70 years in the United States around cannabis. If you want to get a sense of what I mean by that, consider the fact that the US, the same federal government that declares cannabis has no medical value. Remember, this is a Schedule I drug. That's above LSD and cocaine and opiates. This is the same US government actually holds a patent number 6630507, related to cannabis as a neuroprotectant. I don't know if anyone's heard about cannabis as a way of protecting against, they're doing research on cannabis as a way of protecting against concussions or to recover from concussions, but that's owned by NIH and the federal government. So it's this hypocrisy. Yes, it is hypocrisy at its very best. Fiction number 2. There is no type of cannabis user. You might think of cannabis and think of our friends here on the left, and no disrespect to them. I'm a fan of this picture, and I would definitely sport those glasses on the left there. But cannabis, people use cannabis. People you love use cannabis. Seriously ill people use cannabis. Grandparents use cannabis. In fact, seniors are the fastest growing demographic of cannabis users in this country. Actually, women over the age of 60 are the fastest growing demographic of cannabis user. So there is no type. And if you think there is a type, it's because we've been pretty much brainwashed by this war on drugs. Number 3, cannabis is synonymous with smoking. Not true, at least not anymore. You don't have to smoke cannabis. It comes in a wide range of formats. We're constantly creating new ways to consume cannabis, and some of those ways might surprise you. I will reference a little bit later today, if we want to dive a little deeper into what I mean, but just on the left of your screen there, you'll see a picture of bottles. Those are liquid tinctures. That means cannabis suspended in a liquid. And the great thing about a tincture is that you can drop it in a food or a drink and mix it up and consume it that way, or take it sublingually, where you put a few drops under your tongue, and it's very, very easy to titrate, which means it's very easy to adjust your dose in very precise measurements, which is not the same with cooking with cannabis, where you have a cookie or a brownie, and if you have one bite, well, how big is your bite and how big is the cookie, and everyone's body is different. Well, tincture can really be dosed precisely, but there are bath salts, there are topical lotions, there are patches, there are vaporizers. Vaporizers is a means of heating cannabis to a temperature that releases the medically beneficial chemicals in cannabis, the compounds like THC or CBD, but not to the point of combustion. So you can heat this flower so that it releases, in kind of almost like a steam, these chemical compounds that are beneficial. You can inhale them without actually inhaling combusted smoke and all the tar and bad stuff that comes along with that. You can even find cannabis suppositories, believe it or not. It's an amazing actual way for folks who suffer from back pain to take high levels of doses of cannabis without experiencing a psychoactive effect from it. So hopefully a surprise to some folks. Cannabis is used to get high, not by everybody, okay? You don't have to get high from cannabis. There are non-psychoactive cannabinoids in cannabis, the most famous being CBD. Many of you have heard about it. It's now, it's almost presented as a cure-all for all things. It is not, but it does have amazing anti-inflammatory effects, and it's also for reasons we don't fully understand yet, folks with epilepsy, with spasticity issues, can really benefit from cannabis. I just was contacted 2 days ago by the mother of a 2-year-old boy in DC who is back in December was diagnosed with intractable epilepsy. That means he's not basically responding to other medications, and he had 6 months of having up to 100 seizures a day without a single day, not a single day of reprieve, of a single day where he was seizure free. That was until he tried our CBD medication in DC, which we call Jackson's Courage. He tried that, and today will mark his 18th day free of seizures. So we don't fully understand how cannabis works in that regarding epilepsy, but for some folks, it is a life changer, and it's a game changer. So when you take cannabis in a CBD form, it is not psychoactive, but you can also take cannabis at low microdoses. It's another term that you might be hearing more and more these days. A microdose of cannabis typically refers to a dose of that psychoactive compound, that THC, that's at 2.5 milligrams or less. So if you take something that small, it's typically not psychoactive. Also, if you take THC and a low dose of THC and you mix it with a low dose or a high dose of CBD, it can also prevent psychoactivity or reduce psychoactivity. So you do not, if you're somebody who is afraid of feeling high, first of all, that would be a great conversation to have, why people are so scared of being high. But we could have that in a moment. But if you're perhaps you have balance issues, or you're just someone who likes to be in control at all times, you can still benefit from cannabis. In fact, we're working on a formulation right now, a product called Cannabis, that is a broad spectrum. It's basically a proprietary formula that balances out the feeling of being high. So you still get the THC in this product, but you don't feel high. We can help. Go to your local dispensary and tell them that you don't want to feel high, and they'll be able to help you. Last but not least, cannabis isn't really medicine. I was going to play the short clip for you, but the sound is no good. But what I'll tell you is that same product that 2-year-old was taking, that CBD product, it actually started with this young man, Jackson Layden. When I met Jackson, he was 7 years old. He's DC's first pediatric cannabis patient. His mom at the time, he also has intractable epilepsy. His mom at the time was going once a month to Colorado and California to purchase CBD oil and to bring it back to DC, risking her job and her family's safety. But when DC came online, when its medical cannabis program came online, we began producing CBD products. And that was the first time that I saw how profound cannabis can act as a medicine. Jackson had also suffered from intractable epilepsy, was having dozens of seizures a day. And he was a part of a group of 50 kids in DC with intractable epilepsy who were using cannabis. We created a product for them that had, and this was not a heavily, this was not a scientific study, but in our own feedback, we found a 90+% positive impact from this product that we had, that we created in reducing the number of seizures, in some cases eliminating them completely. So this was, when I met Jackson Layden, he really was the person who kind of blew my mind that cannabis could be so impactful on a medical basis. Maybe some of you know folks who are using cannabis for medicine, I bet you do. I bet you do. So that's Jackson Layden, and there was another great audio that I'm not going to be able to play you either, but that relates to a 90-year-old woman who's at the Hebrew home in Riverdale, New York. It's one of the only nursing homes in the country, assisted living facilities in the country that allows for cannabis consumption. She's using cannabis to treat Parkinson's. Really, she says over and over in the NPR report that she doesn't feel the benefit. She's like, I don't know if I feel anything, but she knows when she doesn't take it. And she knows that she's feeling okay in life and her spasticity issues have declined. So there are great stories out there. Hopefully some of you guys on this call, Suzanne, Sherry, maybe you know people that you could share those stories yourself, but tell me, what would you like to understand more about medical cannabis? What's of interest to you and to the residents of Laguna Woods or the members of Concerned Citizens? Instead of me just lecturing at you, I'd love to hear what you think would be interesting.
Let me just start while the others think a little. I'm interested in the consequences of this bizarre dilemma that you describe, where the federal government is forbidding something, and some states are permitting it. And I'm wondering, does that mean that what does it mean? And just before I throw the ball to you, I'm sure many of our viewers are also thinking of the analogy of abortion. This we could see as the direction that we're going to be going, where the federal government or the overall opinion is going to be that it's illegal, and there will be a few states, and then you describe these harrowing tales of these people who have to go through hell and high water to get something which is a really necessary procedure or product. So could you comment on that?
Specifically, your question is what the future looks like for how we're going to move past this.
Well, first, what does it mean? Does it mean that the state overrides the federal government in all cases?
So the federal government has made has made public their current standpoint, which is that they are not going to supersede state law. So they will respect state law. So in states where cannabis is deemed legal for adult use or for medical use, they respect that. However, the moment you leave that state, so traveling with cannabis, going to an airport, which is actually controlled by TSA, which is a federal agency, that is where you can get into trouble. Now, there's not a lot of reports of people TSA confiscating cannabis or turning folks into the local police, but it's possible. Here in DC, where I live, right on the border. What's wild is there's a lot of federal parks, so you could be at our dispensary, we do deliveries, but we have to be very careful about which route our drivers take, because if they get pulled over cutting through Rock Creek Park, which is a federal park, they're going to get pulled over by a federal officer. And that person is not going to be following DC law. They're going to be following federal law. So it can get pretty complicated, at least in theory. In reality, again, at least under the most recent administrations, it's been, state's law have been respected. However, people are still getting arrested for cannabis. That is absolutely the case. And largely, those people are people of color. So
how does that work? In what, where, in Washington, D.C., is that a place where the federal government prevails, for example, has a huge Black population?
It's sadly everywhere. People, just because a state might have a medical cannabis program doesn't mean everyone's able to participate in it. It's one of the challenges. Right now, cannabis is not, medical cannabis is not covered. That is relatively, I mean, if you compare it to a pharmaceutical, it's relatively inexpensive, but for folks trying to pay for it out of pocket, it can, the numbers add up quite quickly. And so for folks that are not able to afford to access the regulated legal cannabis programs in their state, they may not have the money to go to a doctor every year or have the money to register. You know, here in Maryland, I have to go see a doctor every year. You know, that visit could cost $250, you know, right out of your pocket. You're already paying for your cannabis. So what it means is that the folks who are often, you know, low-income folks, the marginalized communities who are already struggling and have suffered so incredibly under the war on drugs are continuing to suffer. We had a push in Pennsylvania around veterans, just to get veterans medical cannabis cards. I would hire, work with a group called Soulful Cannabis to hire doctors for the whole day that would just evaluate veterans for cannabis and write card and make sure that they had their card, because it really protected them. If they were to get pulled over and someone smelled cannabis in their car and they would be searched, you know, if they don't have a medical card in PA, then you're breaking the law. So
I'm sorry. See, I really didn't know that. You have to consider me completely ignorant. So when you say it's legal in states, this is something, or how does it vary that you have to get a doctor's prescription, kind of like I don't know, the pill?
Yeah, to some degree, yes. The rules vary so incredibly. Just state to state, and so it can be really frustrating and complicated for folks to understand, you know, and you really need to be careful when you're taking, you know, for example, your cannabis that you bought legally in Illinois and you're driving to Iowa, and you know you could get in big trouble. So it's a patchwork of laws that is really kind of left to the consumer to navigate. And if they fail to make the right, if they think that something's legal, that it's not, it's on us, it's on the consumer. So we really do need to tackle this at a federal level. This is not going to work forever, this kind of patchwork of state laws. And yes, there's some similarities to what might happen with abortion law, right? With if indeed Roe v. Wade is overturned, where each state is going to have its own potential laws, and it's really scary and complicated. So yeah.
Thank you. Okay, that's very clear. How about our audience?
Excuse me. Can I ask a question now?
Yeah, you're the audience, Sherry.
Okay, you had referenced that article on the number of overdose deaths that have happened from opioids. And one thing I want to point out to the people in cities that are fighting having a dispensary, that's the one place you're never going to get fentanyl poisoning because it's tested. When you go onto the black market, you could get it contaminated, and you don't even know. There could be medical pills that they can repress with fentanyl, and a lot of people are dying. And the only action that they're taking is prolonging the drug war. They're seeking huge life sentences for anybody selling fentanyl. Why don't they make the fentanyl less legal? Restrict I mean, cannabis is the #1 on the schedule. Fentanyl, so many people die of overdoses. Could you talk about how many people in 12,000 years have ever died of a cannabis overdose?
In 12,000 years, we have 0 reported deaths related to cannabis. Zero. Cannabis is one of the safest substances that's out there, safer than Tylenol, ibuprofen, coffee. There's toxicity levels to almost every substance on earth. There really is not a toxic level, a threshold that any human being could reach, at least related to cannabis. So, when you think about the track record of cannabis as compared to other medications that older adults take, I'm thinking, that folks would take for anxiety or sleep or for pain. Even non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications like ibuprofen or naproxen. These medications can wreak havoc on your kidneys. They can threaten your heart, cause gastrointestinal bleeding. Few people want to really be on opiates on a long-term basis. They may work really well for acute pain in that, when you have when you break an arm or you have kidney stones, but for long-term pain, you get constipated and you build up a tolerance so quickly to opioids that you're addicted, so quickly. And sleep and anxiety drugs can leave you sedated and affect your memory. And again, you build up tolerance so quickly. So cannabis is as effective as all of those and has a safety profile that beats all of them. It's pretty miraculous that in 12,000 years, we have no cases of death related to cannabis.
And people talk about cannabis as a gateway drug. I would maintain that it's a gateway off of opioids. And
yeah, it's actually there's become a new term. It's called an exit drug. And what that means is that people are using it in different ways. One way it's an exit drug is that folks are able to reduce the amount of opioids, because cannabis is called what doctors call an opioid potentiator, which means it makes you more sensitive to the opioids that you're taking. So that means you can reduce the dosage that you're taking of opioids when you're using cannabis. And so the goal being to kind of wean yourself off or to just, reduce the dosage. But I think one of the most impactful places cannabis can have on this opioid epidemic is keeping people off of them in the first place. I remember walking through one of our grows with the head of a veterans organization who said, there's just not a lot for our veterans who are struggling with pain. If you have pain that isn't being dealt with with Tylenol, or you have pain that doesn't reach the level of needing codeine or opiates, like what's in the middle? There's not a lot. And cannabis really fills that middle ground. When Tylenol doesn't cut it and opioids are overkill and dangerous and potentially, set someone on a course for addiction. Cannabis is really, I envision a day when cannabis will be in the medicine cabinets of a majority of American households, and used for everything from upset tummies to appetite stimulation, to help us sleep. I really think that this will become normalized. Right now, it's still in this kind of very exciting, sexy, dangerous, scary, like there's a lot of emotions around it, but hopefully cannabis will just become normal at one point and not be so much drama associated with it. But I think we're still a little ways away from that.
thank you, Rick.
Okay, Jonathan, you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yes, thank you, Sue. Let me state the bottom line question first, and then lay in a few facts that leads me to the question. Question is, to what extent has cannabis really been rigorously studied over the years for a great variety of conditions and illnesses?
So Thanks, Jonathan. There actually has been substantial studies done on cannabis. They haven't come out of the states, and the reason they haven't come out of the U.S. Is because, by definition, cannabis has no medicinal value according to the federal government. So getting permission to be able to study cannabis in the US is incredibly difficult, and it has been for a long time. It's getting easier in recent years with the Biden administration, but by and large, in the past number of decades, unless you were trying to prove that cannabis was dangerous, you weren't going to get permission to study cannabis. And even if you were able to get permission to study cannabis, only one university, the University of Mississippi, was allowed to produce cannabis for use in trials in research. And the cannabis that they produce there is some of the worst cannabis that you could imagine. It is it's very it's not rich in cannabinoids. It's not, the potency is incredibly low, but it does exist. So because of the United States reluctance to engage in that research, much of it came out of Europe and really Israel. So if you look at some of the research that's come out of Israel, it is substantial. It abides by modern scientific standards, and I think most would say it's substantial. Even the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine cites scientific support for the therapeutic use of cannabis, at least for chronic pain. Their expert committee evaluated the weight of evidence regarding cannabis for certain types of health conditions. And here's actually, I have a slide here. I'll pop it up here. You can see what they had to say. There we go. So this is they have 5 types of evidence that they standards that they apply, which one is conclusive, which is strong evidence, supports a conclusion; substantial, which is strong evidence supports a statistical association; moderate, some evidence supports or refutes a statistical association; limited, being weak evidence; and then insufficient. And here's what they found. So their findings were that there is conclusive or substantial evidence for the treatment of chronic pain in adults with cannabis. That's where the strongest evidence is. That is really non-refutable, irrefutable. There's also moderate evidence that shows cannabinoids are effective in improving short-term sleep outcomes in sleep disturbances that are associated with chronic pain and also with MS. And there's more limited evidence showing that it helps with depression. That doesn't mean that it doesn't help some folks with depression, but the association between depression and cannabis use, it's not showing up in the research yet. So there may be some anecdotal examples, but it's not there yet. But that's where we're at as far as Western medicine. Chronic pain is really where the substance is with research.
We're almost out of time. I wonder if I could throw one last question that is directly related to what you're just talking about. Namely, might you be able to speak more directly to seniors? What sorts of health problems that we're likely to have do you think might most likely be alleviated with cannabis?
Absolutely. Anything from seniors are sometimes on a lot of different medications, and with that can come nausea, right? So nausea and cannabis, it's another example of treating something where there's a lot of research out there. Cannabis can help those folks dealing with nausea. Cannabis can help stimulate appetite. So if you're somebody who's, if you're in cancer treatment, or if folks who are struggling with anorexia, cannabis can be incredibly helpful there. Folks with MS or spinal cord injuries, have had a lot of success with cannabis. I mentioned epilepsy. I mean, that's not related to seniors, but pain, acute pain, chronic pain, pain that comes post-operative, chronic pain that's both neuropathic pain or non-cancer related pain. All these things can be helpful with cannabis. It's very much dose dependent. So don't just think that any cannabis you take will help with pain. You need to be incredibly careful to start slow and low dose when you're talking about treating cannabis with pain. I always suggest starting with a microdose of 2.5 milligrams and then going up from there. Glaucoma. There's decent evidence showing cannabis can help with glaucoma, but there has also been evidence showing that the newer medications out there are even more effective. Parkinson's is showing a lot of promising evidence in research. Hypertension, psychiatric disorders like anxiety, alcohol and opioid withdrawal symptoms, sleep disorders, inflammation. There's even actually some research out there looking at Alzheimer's and dementia, and cannabis's ability to help there. And lastly, the last thing I would think of would be inflammatory bowel, basically tummy issues, right? Cannabis can be incredibly helpful with those types of things. And if this sounds, because if it sounds like I'm naming too many things for you and you think, wow, this sounds like snake oil or a cure-all, here's the reason. Let me show you one last slide here.
We're really about.
We're out of time. Well, let me say this, Suzanne, you see all those dots on that body that you're seeing right in front of you? Those are the receptors that allow the body to interact with cannabis, and they're all over your body. There's one place that they're not, which is the brainstem, which is why there's no amount of cannabis that will make somebody stop breathing, like with opioids. But that's one of the reasons that some folks say, wow, this sounds like snake oil. It can do so much. It's because your body has this endocannabinoid system with receptors all throughout it, waiting to interact with cannabinoids. In fact, your body makes its own cannabinoids with anandamide, which is what's responsible for the runner's high that people feel. So anyway, I know I'm going over our time here, but yeah. I get excited.
You're a great salesman for your product. There's no question. But I think the other lesson is that if there's really no major danger, then it would seem that what could be the harm in at least giving it a try if you have some kind of problem, because it might help, but it won't hurt. That's what I'm hearing you say.
For a lot of folks, that I would really recommend it. Now, that doesn't mean you can do that in a safe and responsible manner, and you can be less safe. So I would always recommend, if you're trying something new, to be with other folks. Make sure that someone knows you're doing this, because you could lose balance. You could. There's also different types of interactions potentially with medication. It's not exactly clear that there are real hard no's as far as what medications you could be on, but talk to your doctor first. Start slow, low dose. Remember that a lot of this is going to require research that you have to do. Your doctor may not have all the answers. They did not get trained in how to administer cannabis in medical school. So, folks like talk to Sherry, talk to Suzanne, reach out to me. We can help you.
Great. All right. Well, it's been a wonderful program. Concerned Citizens thanks Rabbi James Kahn for sharing his expertise with us. And we thank you, our audience, for joining us. Without a doubt, you know more about cannabis than you did an hour ago. Our next program promises to offer insights into yet another fascinating topic. Until then, goodbye from Concerned Citizens Presents. We hope to see you next time.